Good morning, everybody. Warm welcome, everybody. I will allow others to come through and just let them join in, and then we can make a slow start. Okay. I'll give it a few seconds. It's 10 o'clock exactly for now. So let's give just less than a minute, and then I know your time is precious, and then we can start slowly. Okay. So we are about 200 delegates so far, 207. Warm welcome to those who just joined in. Okay, shall we make a slow start? Joseph, yeah, let's make a slow start.
Absolutely, Rommel.
Again, good morning, everybody. Please settle in, and then we are about to start. Now, my name is Romalori, and I am accompanied here by one of my colleagues this morning, Joseph Singleton. We are both tissue viability nurses from Coloplast, and we will be delivering and facilitating the session this morning. Now, welcome to this webinar, a coroner's court simulation, and we'll be focusing around leg ulcers today as part of that. Now, this week, if you are not aware, is Legs Matter Awareness Week. And the focus of this year's campaign is all about power of speaking up, the power of speaking up from a patient and a healthcare professional perspective. And today here at Coloplast, we are speaking up and sharing the importance of good documentation and leg ulcer management. Now, we will start the program by a session on the importance of good documentation. And you will also hear, and that will be delivered by Joseph, and you will also hear from Joseph around wound management and the simplification of using a three-step approach that was developed by Coloplast. Then we'll have a short 5 to 10 minute break just to allow you to have some stretch, have a cup of tea, have some water, and then we will facilitate the coroner's court simulation. Now, I say we, I will be leading on the simulation. And at the end of the webinar, you will receive a certificate, a link of the recording, and also a copy of a pathways around simplification of wound management and management of leg ulcerations. Now, we highly encourage audience participation in this. Now, I know this is a webinar, but please use the chat function, and we will be using that throughout the format of the presentation. So I'm going to repeat it again. So it saves us asking the same questions again and again. You will receive a copy of the certificate after the webinar. Please give us a couple of weeks, 2 to 4 weeks maybe, for the certificate to come through. You will also receive a copy of the pathways that Joseph will be sharing with you this morning. And you will also receive a link of the recording of today's session. Okay, right. So without further delay, I'll pass you on to Joseph to start the session. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Rommel. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here today to go through the importance of your documentation session in this Meet the Coroner webinar this morning. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's get right into it. Before you do, just want to let you know, as a tissue viability nurse for Coloplast, also currently I'm working clinically at the moment, so it's also important that I'm going to try to bring some clinical examples into the session today to try and flesh out some of the topics that we're going to talk about. So, the importance of your documentation. I think as nurses and as healthcare professionals, we're all aware, or should all be well drilled into us throughout our training and through our everyday practice, how important our documentation is. It is incredibly important. It is our safeguard for us and for our patients. It is the evidence of what we are doing throughout the day with our patients and the evidence that we are delivering the care that we are meant to do. Okay, I'm sure everyone has heard the old adage, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. We'll probably mention that again later today. And even though might be not technically true, because things do happen even if they're not documented, it's incredibly difficult to prove that something happened if it's not well documented. And that is why it is so important. We must be able to evidence and prove what we have done with our patients and that we did our best evidence-based practice. So the course of the next 45-50 minutes, we're going to look into why our documentation is so important, the role of the coroner, if things do go wrong, what we might expect. But ultimately, this is also about leg ulcers and Legs Matter Week, as Rommel quite eloquently said. So let's have a little look at leg ulcers to start. And we'll start quite nicely with the definition of a venous leg ulcer and understand the landscape around venous leg ulceration at the moment. So NICE, as you can see on the screen, we've got the NICE define a venous leg ulcer, or VLU, as we often say for short, as a break in the skin below the knee, which is not healed within 2 weeks. Okay, so it's a nice broad, it's a nice snappy. And the reason we've changed within 2 weeks, because we used to say leg ulcers more 4 to 6 weeks after not healing. Now we say 2 weeks because we want to act quickly and appropriately to get these wounds healed, to stop them from becoming chronic wounds, which obviously are a lot harder to heal. So all patients with a VLU should have a prompt, full, holistic assessment. We look at the whole of the patient, and we're wanting to treat any underlying disease that's associated with the development of that ulcer, such as, is it a venous leg ulcer? So is venous insufficiency causing this wound to stop healing or not heal? Or is it arterial? Or is there another undiagnosed cause, such as autoimmune? For those patients diagnosed with a VLU, the key component in their management must be strong compression therapy, okay? The majority of our leg ulcers are VLUs, venous leg ulcers, and we know the gold standard for treating them is compression therapy. We have a wealth of evidence to be able to support this now. And in all our best practice statements, all our guidance, compression is that first real big level of treatment that we need to get our patients in, to get their blood flowing and get them healing in a timely manner. There's a photo on the screen of the best practice statements, okay, from Wounds UK. If no one has this document, I strongly advise you to log on to the Wounds UK website and download the most recent edition, the second edition from 2022, which is a wonderful reference and guide for you in your practice to support you managing venous leg ulcers. So let's have a little look at the impact of leg ulcers in our current UK. So financial cost is absolutely huge. Leg ulcers cause a massive loss of function and require long-term healthcare, often resulting in high financial burden. And there's been lots of work in recent years, over the last 10 to 15 years, looking at what that financial burden might be. Okay, if everyone's heard of Julian Guest, a health economist, he's done lots of work, especially with the National Wound Care Strategy and with Kath and Peter Vowden, consultants in leg ulceration and vascular, looking at the potential cost of these leg ulcers. And through some of the fantastic work he's done, he's found that the rough cost of venous leg ulcers, that's just venous leg ulcers, is about almost £2 billion within the UK. And that's a lot of money, and that's a huge drain on our NHS resources. There's an average of roughly £7,600 per patient with a venous leg ulcer, and that's a healed venous leg ulcer. So the average time once a venous leg ulcer is healed, the average amount that venous leg ulcer has cost is around £7,600, which is a huge amount of money and spend. That can increase to around £13,500 for unhealed venous leg ulcers. And again, that's an average. So sometimes a lot higher than that. And I'm sure the majority of you will know of many patients who have had their venous leg ulcers for a long time, which has had massive impacts on their life, massive impacts on your time and the healthcare services. But just think about one of these patients and think about the potential, who have had their wound for a long time, how much money that is generating. Some of these patients have their leg ulcers for years, and those years, that cost starts to add up, okay? Especially when it comes to our time as healthcare professionals and the time that patient is taking from the NHS. So it is in our best interest to really manage and deal with these leg ulcers as soon and as early as possible and get the treatment right at first point when we first see them. Unfortunately, we also have a very high recurrence rate of venous leg ulcers. So half the people within 12 months heal. So 12 months is a long time. We want to be getting these people ideally healing within 4 to 6 weeks. So that projected healing time is a huge cost and burden on our time in the NHS. But we generally get 70% recurrence with patients when they're not fitted with appropriate compression hosiery. And this really shows the power of compression hosiery, not just to heal, but to keep patients healed. And that can be really difficult often when we have to have that conversation with our patients once they have presented with venous disease, is actually you have to have compression probably for the rest of your life in some form. And if you're not wearing your compression, you're likely to recur. Often it is down to the patient to be able to wear their compression, but without that understanding of the importance, often they will lapse and they will reoccur, and then they're back in the NHS system, and those costs of the venous leg ulcers are stacking up again. So, and we know from our current situation in the UK, there is a lot of variation in care across the UK, from place to place. And on the screen at the moment, you can see an example of the variation. And this is taken from NHS Right Care that released it in 2017. It's a scenario that was put together to demonstrate what happens when there is a suboptimal care pathway versus an optimal care pathway. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through it step by step, but ultimately when we use a suboptimal pathway and we're not treating a patient properly, we're not performing a holistic assessment, we end up with incredibly high costs and the patient does not heal quickly. You can see there a rough cost, roughly £5,673 with a suboptimal pathway. This is to highlight that when we get it right and we implement an optimal pathway, we holistically assess, we get the patient into compression early, if we understand and we get a venous leg ulcer diagnosis, then we can heal them within 6 weeks, more often than not. Okay, and the patient is in the actual healthcare system a lot less, and our cost savings can be anywhere as low as around £500. I would strongly advise you all to potentially write down Betty's story if you've never seen it before or heard of it. And there's a beautiful video online via YouTube from NHS Right Care, which in about 5 minutes goes through the suboptimal and optimal pathways. The video can be used for healthcare professionals, but also used to guide your patients through to help them understand the importance of right care and what right care and optimal care looks like with regard to venous leg ulcers. So it's quite easy to say that VLUs, our venous leg ulcers, can have a huge impact on our patients that we see. They have a massive, massive impact in various ways on the patient, especially their quality of life, with associated personal, social, and potential psychological effects. I have seen numerous times patients who have ended up socially isolating because of a leg ulcer. The smell, the pain, the fact that they feel like they're being a burden, the worry how other people will perceive them with such a wound on their leg, leads them to potentially not want to see anyone at all. And the only person they end up seeing is often their healthcare professional. And sometimes they even become emotionally dependent and institutionalized almost with that healthcare professional, and they rely on them. And that then can affect them potentially even wanting to keep a leg ulcer in extreme circumstances. And they often will do things to make sure they keep with that ulcer so they don't heal. So it's important that we understand the extremes of these impacts. The significant financial burden on us and on the patient. Okay, sometimes leg ulcers, especially in younger adults, can take them out of work. It can stop them from working, it prevent them to getting a job. It can take to long absences with sickness. And it can be a huge worry, especially financially on those patients. Pain is another huge impact that we have. Sometimes there is often a myth that venous leg ulcers aren't as painful. It's often seen that arterial leg ulcers are the most painful leg ulcers. And certainly in my experience, that isn't true at all. Venous leg ulcers can just be, if not even more painful than arterial leg ulcers. And that pain can have a profound effect on our patients. It can lead to non-concordance. It can lead to patients being afraid to seek intervention, being afraid to see their healthcare professionals because they're worried that the pain might be so tense if they're treated. So it is something that we often always have to address and make sure that we are looking for good analgesia. We are coaching the patient on the expectations around pain, but to let us know their pain thresholds so we can address it properly. Now, it's really important to understand these impacts on the patient, that we understand all of these potential impacts, and we can only really do that through doing a full, accurate, holistic assessment, and that's crucial to delivering that good management plan and treatment for our patients. Other impacts of leg ulcers as well, just to have a bit more of a focus, because we have to understand that these things aren't easy. It's very easy to become desensitized to the impact of leg ulcers on our patient. So again, it's good to focus on the other impacts these might have. They can lead to severe disabilities, and in extreme cases, and we don't see it often, thank goodness, but venous leg ulcers can in some circumstances lead to amputation, and that can have a massive effect on the patient. It can lead a huge impact on their quality of life and a shortening of their life expectancy as well. Increasing massive hospital stays. VLUs can also lead to infection and potential deep infection down into the bone for osteomyelitis, and they can be life-threatening. Patients can wind up in hospital, potentially with sepsis, and maybe even on critical care. They might need surgery, prolonged periods of forced immobility as well, where they are in hospital, they aren't able to mobilise and walk. This can also lead to fatigue and muscle wastage and even more complications. So we can't underestimate the impact that these venous leg ulcers are having on our patients. Now, bringing it back to the best practice recommendations again, this time it is important to say, okay, we know for our venous leg ulcers, we need to check them and get them into compression therapy. That is the cornerstone of good management, to improve that blood flow up the leg and decongest the leg and allow that wound to heal. So the best practice statement brings us on to red flags. We need to make sure they're suitable for compression. We need to check that they don't have any problems with their arteries or any arterial insufficiency. Now, instantly, we want to get patients into compression as early as possible. And without a full assessment and our arterial brachial pressure index test, which we want to do ideally within the first 2 weeks of a wound presenting, a patient with the leg ulcer presenting, we don't want that to delay us putting patients into compression. Now, in the absence of red flags, we can put patients safely into 20 millimeters of mercury compression, or reduced compression, as we often refer it to, be that reduced compression bandaging or potentially reduced compression hosiery, like a 20 millimeters or lower liner that we could potentially get in. But for this to be done safely, we must check that they have no red flags of any arterial disease, okay, or any complications. Our red flags are any acute infection of the leg or foot that is going untreated. We need to get that treated first before we can instigate compression therapy. Any symptoms of sepsis, so high fever, or low temp potentially, tachycardia, rapid breathing, pale, any confusion, any instance of slurred speech. Obviously, then our priority is to get that patient seen urgently and get them into hospital so their sepsis can be treated. Acute or chronic limb-threatening ischemia. So if there are any signs and symptoms that the patient's peripheral arterial circulation is significantly compromised, so that they have a pale, cold limb, for example, they have a very poor capillary refill, any signs of severe claudication, so that's pain on walking, then we should really be making sure, pulseless foot as well, so if they lack pulses or we can't find pulses, then again, that is an urgent issue and we need to be getting them straight away into hospital, probably via 999 in an ambulance, to get them assessed by vascular surgeons and hopefully that issue corrected. If there is any suspected acute deep vein thrombosis, we don't want to be starting compression. That needs to be treated first. So if they do have symptoms of a DVT, we will again want to be getting them seen urgently by the medical team, getting them anticoagulated and that DVT treated before we can treat them with compression. And then also another big red flag is if we do suspect a form of cancer that is the cause of the wound, then also we should not be putting them into compression and getting them seen urgently, referral via the GP for investigation with the oncologists. So, excuse me. So our best practice recommendations also say that, as I mentioned earlier, we should be having a full vascular assessment of their arterial supply within 14 days of original presentation. Now, we understand that this is very challenging in the modern NHS, often with how busy we are with staffing levels. Sometimes this isn't easy to do straight away. 14 days is the guide, is the optimal, but we want to try and do it as soon as possible. Our leg ulcers with adequate arterial supply, once we've had that assessment, should be placed into full graduated compression or strong compression. And that's 40 millimeters of mercury at the ankle going up the leg. We should also refer for venous surgical interventions to the local vascular service to review to see if there are any surgical options for treatment. We should be monitoring healing at least every 4 weeks. And if deteriorating or no significant progress in a leg ulcer after instigating compression therapy and with a good management plan, we should be referring on or escalating either to local tissue viability services or local vascular services for review. So, what happens when things go wrong? Now, I think most of us are probably more used to hearing incident reportings due to wounds like pressure ulcers, which has been at the forefront of incidents and safety for a long period of time. But leg ulcers are getting a stronger voice behind them. And leg ulcers are becoming more of a focus for the government, for NHS trusts around the country, and for us as nurses and for patients. And with more of a focus comes more of a spotlight to highlight where things might not go wrong and potential harm might be. And harm can happen with mismanagement of leg ulcers. Okay, harm can happen. For example, if we do fail to do an arterial assessment and we don't pick up and highlight that the patient does have quite significant peripheral vascular disease and that patient does end up in compression, we could cause severe harm. We could cause critical limb ischemia. And in those cases, obviously, we'd need to put an incident report in to be able to manage that incident and review why it happened and look for the learning behind it. So we're just going to take a minute or so just to look at what that clinical incident reporting process is likely to be. Now, hopefully, most of you are already very familiar with this process and know it quite well. But if not, again, it's just good to go through it so we all understand what that should and what good should look like. It's important to understand what good looks like so we know we're doing it properly and getting it right. So if it ever does come up in a coroner's court or in a civil case, we can look back and say we did do all of the steps appropriately. We did what the legal team and our guidance says we should have done. So clinical incident reporting, what we do if we do get a clinical incident around our leg ulceration, such as the example I gave, we report it via our incident reporting system, whatever that might be. For a lot of you out there, it might be Datix, for example. Diagnosis verified. So we also look at what that clinical instance is and we get it referred to another senior colleague, and that looks locally, and we look and clarify that clinical incident. A review meeting is then called to discuss the incident and decide on the next steps, such as who's involved. Is it a safeguarding? Which are the specialisms that have been involved with this incident? And we need to make sure we know who's going to be involved in the RCA process, the root cause analysis investigation. So all of those people can be called appropriately. At this point, we need to implement our duty of candor. Okay, so what that is, it's making sure and hopefully you're all familiar with duty of candor. We will discuss it later, but making sure that the patient and patients or carers or next of kin are aware that a clinical incident has occurred, and that we will be investigating the incident to ensure we understand why it happened and bring any learning back from that. Okay, and that's an opportunity for the patient and family carer to ask any questions that they might have about it as well and raise any concerns at that time. Then the RCA, our investigating officer for the trust, is obviously commissioned the level 2 RCA probably to investigate. And the RCA investigation, the root cause analysis investigation, is just that. It's to look at what is the root cause for why this clinical incident happened. What's involved in that RCA investigation, and hopefully some of you will have been involved in this process. I myself have been involved in a lot, and it can be very complicated and very time consuming because we have to look through the patient's records with a fine tooth comb really to make sure we're looking at everything that was documented and looking for the evidence or any lapses in care that were put there. And we often have to interview as well the clinician or any of the healthcare professionals involved in delivering that care, and potentially the patients and relatives themselves who might have been there. So we are building a big picture around what happened pre-incident and also post-incident, so we can get a really good feel for why that might have happened. That then will hopefully we'll be able to determine the root cause. So for the example I gave earlier, is it the fact that the nurse was not trained to give an ABPI assessment? They weren't aware how to do it, so they just assumed that they should just put the patient straight into compression, for example. It's that point when we determine that root cause, then we can make the recommendations for how we address it. So is it more staff training? Is it to look at our policies and procedures to put more robust policies and procedures in place? Do we need a pathway which is easier for people to follow to make sure that we are preventing that incident in the future? And then it's taking those lessons learned, implementing them, and also sharing them with the whole of our trust as a lesson learned, to make sure that everyone's aware that this can happen, especially in the area that it happened. If it's a district nurse issue out in practice, that the whole team are aware of this issue, they're aware of what led up to it and the root cause again, so they hopefully prevent any of that happening again. And we share with the family and what happened and then what we were going to do to address that too. So that's just a really quick instance. Obviously we could dive into a lot more about clinical incident reporting and RCAs. You could probably do a whole day on it, but just for all of our sanity and a little bit of time, we'll move on. So possible consequences. Now, hopefully we don't get things wrong. As healthcare professionals, we obviously are duty bound to deliver good evidence-based care. We are all on our NMC register, and we should be delivering really, really good evidence-based care and documenting it incredibly well. But unfortunately, bad things do happen and clinical instances do happen. And in that case, we would need to be aware of the potential consequences of those incidents. Now, unfortunately, everything you can see on your screen here are the possible consequences when things go wrong. So these are things through defensible, non-defensible nursing practice. What that's referring to is, are we able to defend when something's gone wrong? Ultimately, are we able to, has the healthcare professional delivering the care done everything they've done right? And is it documented? So can we prove that they did it right? If we can prove it and we've got good documentation or good witnesses, then often we can defend the practice. Where evidence is poor because documentation is poor, then maybe we aren't able to defend that nursing practice, meaning that often if a case is brought against the trust, it will be a settlement out straight away, because we know that if we would try to defend ourselves in court, we wouldn't be able to. Sometimes if we've been found that our practice hasn't been good, we might be called to an NMC fitness to practice tribunal. And again, I'm lucky enough never to have gone through that, but I know colleagues who have, and it is quite a horrible process. It's quite a long-winded process, and you are put under, as a healthcare professional, if it is you who's under the spotlight, you are put under a massive microscope. and it can bring a lot of stress to you, because potentially your NMC registration could be removed, which means your livelihood is potentially gone as well. Employment tribunals are another thing. So has your employer deemed that you've done something wrong and want to take it to an investigation and take legal action against you as the individual working for them, okay, to proportion blame to you? Possible. A civil claim, negligence. So if a nurse has been negligent, or if a healthcare professional, sorry, I should say, has been negligent, as a civil claim, they've broken the law. Has that been brought to them and against them? Court of protection is a court of protection which is brought in if there are any mental health or the Mental Health Act is imposed upon the patient. That is there to protect the patient, but if negligence has gone, they will often deal with the issue. Can also lead to disciplinary capability hearings, again, for the individual. So is there any actions going to be taken, other further actions taken by the trust against an individual who might be seen to have been wrong or unlawful practice? Any instance might lead to a death of a patient, and in that case, if it's not clear, and we are going to really dig into this shortly, this is the purpose of today, a coroner's inquest may be called. It can also lead to magistrates' Crown Court. So if there's a serious criminal offence that has been committed by the healthcare professional, that could end up in Crown Court. With that comes a lot of press and media speculation and potential jail term, and because the individual is being scrutinised if they've actually broken the law. And also public inquiries can be called as well to look into any potential instance if they feel that none of these have brought a resolution to it as well. And then public inquiries can also lead on to reopening of any other prosecution pathways. So these are things we kind of really want to prevent. And ultimately, when we're thinking about preventing things, we have to look and reflect about our own accountability as healthcare professionals. Okay, we are personally accountable for our actions and for the care we give. No one else. Okay, it's always easy to look to apportion blame when wrongdoing has been confirmed, but we should always be looking at our own practice. Have we done what we were supposed to do? Have we followed our policies, procedures? Have we followed our code of conduct? That is what we should always be asking ourselves. Okay, and we should be always remembering that we are accountable for our actions. We make judgments, and we make judgments under high pressure scenarios a lot of the time in a variety of circumstances. And we often have to use our own professional knowledge and skills to make those decisions. And they should be based on good evidence-based practice and in the person we're treating's best interests. But are we always able to do that comfortably? Do we have the skills to be able to do that comfortably and well? That is something we should obviously always be asking ourselves. We need to be able to justify the decisions we make as healthcare professionals. Do we have the evidence to back up on that decision we made? So, for example, again, did we put a patient straight into 40 millimeters of mercury compression? Are we able to justify that? Should we have actually made sure they went into 20 initially and done an OBPI and done that full vascular assessment? Okay, we need to be able to make, we're justifying based on our evidence. And our documentation must support our decisions that we've made. Okay, we must be writing ultimately why we've done that. Okay, if it's not built into a care plan, we should be always thoroughly documenting we made X because of Y. And we will dive into that documentation a little bit later and how we can generally use just a little bit of extra language to put that supportive documentation in place. So just as earlier I relayed to duty of candour, I wanted to just, again, at this point, highlight why that's so important. The NHS has learned, probably through a lot of hard examples, why being open and honest is so important. We should never try to hide anything. When we try to hide anything, that often is a mission of guilt in a lot of cases, and if found out can be instantly damning. but also that's not how we should be working as nurses and as people. We should always be open and honest. And we find out when we are open and honest, our patients are more receptive to us, our family are more receptive, and they're more likely to understand why things might go wrong. It is vital that we understand this responsibility. It will help us understand how and why things went wrong and to avoid similar instances in the future. The NMC Midwifery Council Code highlights our duty of candour really well, and on the screen you can see the excerpt from our NMC guidance, which talks about professional duty of candour and why it's important. I again would say to everybody here, this is something that you should have at the click of a finger, really, to remind you as a healthcare professional what we should be doing when things go wrong. Okay. We always want our patients and our family and friends to understand what is happening at the right time. Okay. So moving on. Now we're going to talk about why we're kind of here today. And most of us are here today probably because we're wanting to know, what is it like when we might be faced with having to attend a coroner's court and an inquest? Now, some of you who are here today may have experienced coroner's court, may have a good understanding of what happens. Hopefully the majority of you haven't. It's something that obviously we don't want to attend because it means that there might have been something that potentially has gone wrong, or there is generally unclear circumstances to why a patient has died, which means that our practice and our care can often be under scrutiny. So it's important to then understand at this point what is actually the role of the coroner, because sometimes that is quite misinterpreted and people don't really understand what a coroner's job actually is. Now, a coroner's job is actually very simple. Their job is really just to determine if a person has died, how, when, and where they came by their death. Ultimately, that is it. When they answer those questions, it may lead to other things, proceedings. It might highlight inadequacies of care. It might highlight breaking of legal issues. So someone has broken the law potentially. But the coroner's role is just to literally ascertain those three things: how, where, and when that person came by their death. So the when and the where is often quite easy to say. They died at X time at such a location. It's the how which is often the really difficult bit to understand or isn't often clear. And that's where the coroner probably really spends most of their time, trying to get to the how that patient came about their death. So the coroner is generally called when a death is suspected to have been either sudden with unknown cause, it's either violent in nature, unnatural, or unnatural. The coroner then can decide to call an inquest. They want to probably call a post-mortem to get more detailed information. And then, like I said, potentially an inquest if they think they are unable to ascertain the key elements of the how. Now, often coroners will try to call an inquest quite quickly because the quicker we get to things, we know that the more likely we are to dig to the truth of it, and the easier it is because it's fresh in everyone's mind and it's fresh and it's easier to access documentation, etc., etc. But sometimes coroners' interests aren't able to be called quickly, and a pre-inquest hearing might be called by the coroner, which is like a small little interim hearing if we can't get the full inquest within the first couple of days or weeks within the death of the patient. Now, the pre-inquest review hearing, or the PIR as it's sometimes referred to, the coroner basically decides actually how long the inquest is likely to be, will a jury be needed, or whether any other hearings are needed, and then also when that might be. So jury are uncommon in coroners' inquests and coroners' courts, but they are generally the coroner's choice to call them, and he will normally call them in cases where the death is not due to a natural cause. It's clear that the death might be due to a little bit of an unnatural call or foul play potentially. Now, the coroner's inquest. This is the legal inquiry into the death, okay? And it's when the cause, as I mentioned, is unknown, violent, or unnatural, okay? Now, the coroner's inquest is always held in public, okay? That means that anyone can turn up on the day and ask to sit in and witness the inquest, okay? If you ever, it's probably not much of a fun day out, but if anyone ever is interested during their spare time, or sometimes you can get dispensation from work if you're dealing with a lot of potential inquests, to go and take some time out to go and witness an inquest. You can just go if you know the time and place and attend and view and observe. And this certainly will give you the feeling, if you've never been to one before, what is entailed during the coroner's court hearing. So during the inquest as well, the goal is to determine the cause of death, and it's usually held, and it's like I mentioned, it's usually held without a jury. So moving on, if my slide will work. Just frozen for a moment. There we go, sorry. So your role in the coroner's inquest. So your duty, if you are called to coroner's court to give evidence or provide evidence, is to the court and to the coroner. And ultimately, it's to answer questions as accurately as you can under oath. So it's the truth, okay? It's not to point blame. And I can't stress this enough. Everyone is always very worried that a coroner is about finding someone to blame, okay? It is not. The coroner is not looking for blame. If it looks like that towards the end, when the coroner understands the how, that there may be a blame, then it is referred on for further proceedings. But the coroner's court itself is not about that. It's just purely about understanding what happened and how. So your records, this is when your records and your documentation are incredibly important because they support your testimony. They will be the evidence to say what you said happened, okay? So ultimately, what we want is if the coroner asks you a question, you can answer verbally, but then you should also hopefully be able to evidence that through documentation. You've done what you said you did. It is important that when asked, you only state facts, okay? The coroner will not be interested in speculation. He won't be interested in what you think may have happened. He is only interested in what you know happened. So if you are ever called to sit in the coroner's court, make sure that you're only giving facts that you know happened. If you don't know an answer to a question, it is okay to say you don't know the answer to that question, okay? If you are called and you're sat on that stand, you never have to don't feel like you have to give an answer if you don't know that answer. It is fine to say, no, you don't know. It is then for the coroner to look at other means to try to find the answer to that question. So through questioning, and the coroner could potentially question a whole variety of people. I have attended a number of coroner's court in my time. Luckily, I've never been called to the stand to give evidence. I had one incident where I was called by the coroner to give evidence around a patient who had passed away secondary to an infection from a pressure ulcer. Just so it's clear, I forgot to say earlier that my background is acute tissue viability. I now work within community for Coloplast, but my background is acute. And so I had been directly involved in this patient's care. I had been to the ward to review this patient and given a management plan. And I was called. This patient had unfortunately died secondary to sepsis. A lot of other complications as well, diabetes, pneumonia as well. Luckily, I ended up not having to go to coroner's court. I received a letter a couple of weeks after my call to say that the coroner didn't want to see me in court because my documentation was good enough and it was thorough enough. He didn't felt that my presence there would actually bring anything because the answers to his questions had already been answered in my documentation. And I can't tell you my level of relief that I didn't have to go to coroner's court. Having been before to observe and knowing the kind of spotlight that is under there, it is tough. It is very emotional. You do feel like you're under scrutiny. My relief was palpable. And it was a perfect example, and it's a true lived example of how your documentation can ultimately even prevent you from being in these horrible situations. So never think that your documentation won't stop you. It will. It can be. If it's that good, it might actually prevent you from going. So when the coroner has delved into the hows and the whys, and he's answered these questions of all of those involved in the round of the patient's death, he will come to a finding of fact or a verdict. Okay. And on the screen at the moment, you can see the potential different verdicts that the coroner may come to. And it's one normally of these 6. So the first one might be of natural causes. So if he finds through his questioning that there was no wrongdoing, everything was done right, and the patient generally just died secondary to their illness, he will declare a verdict of natural causes. And there's no contributed, obviously human intervention, as it says there, hasn't actually affected that patient's death. Okay. Another one was it accidental death or misadventure? So that would be if the cause of death was unnatural but not unlawful, so no law would be broken. So this would be if the deceased has taken a deliberate action that has resulted in their death. So for example, if you have someone who was an intravenous drug user, for example, and let's say we've got an IVDU with leg ulcers, which maybe some of you have managed before. At this point, they may have still been using. They overdosed on their intravenous drug, and that the result of that overdose was their death. That patient didn't intend to kill themselves, but that was the result of their action. Then if that was made clear in the coroner's court, the coroner would put a verdict forward of accidental death or misadventure. Unlawful killing, that is where the coroner does find that the law has been broken. And this would be examples: murder, manslaughter, infanticide, or serious driving offence collision. So where there has been a direct cause and there is negligence involved and someone has directly caused that person's death. He can then declare suicide as well. So if it's clear that a patient or a person has taken their own life voluntarily, and that is clear through the investigation, then a finding of suicide can be found. Neglect is also another finding the coroner can declare, and that's where there's been a gross failure to provide that person who died with their basic needs that could have potentially prevented their death. Okay, so for example, let's say a patient is admitted into a hospital and they are left, as we often hear on the news, potentially left on a trolley in A&E for up to 48 hours, and they are not given any medication. They might not be given fluid that may have potentially saved their life. Then the coroner, through his investigation, could declare a finding of neglect from the institution. And then probably the last and most interesting one, and quite a common finding that the coroner will find, is a narrative verdict. Now, the narrative verdict is where the coroner, the outcome doesn't fit into any of those others, but the coroner sets out the circumstances of the death in a detailed way based on the evidence heard. Okay, so it's basically where you're saying X happened, Y happened. Okay, there was no potential blame to admit, but there might have been potential little reasons why that may have contributed, but aren't clear cut in the patient's death. Okay, so he might say, in this case, I found that there's no unlawful killing, there's no neglect, but certain things might have been not done properly that probably haven't resulted in the patient's death, but have been found anyway and aren't optimum. We aren't managing that patient appropriately. If a narrative verdict is found and the coroner does declare a narrative verdict, he will often issue a Regulation 28. Now, a Regulation 28, this is after the inquest, it's a prevention of death report, or referred to as Regulation 28 report. And this is when the coroner thinks that there could have been steps put in place, or there could be steps put in place to stop any avoidable deaths or any contributing factors that held to that death. So this happens when the coroner's heard the evidence and he thinks we could put some actions in place. So he will write a Regulation 28 report and send it to the institution that was caring for the patient at that time or authority. And they then are tasked to read the report and make potential changes that are suggested by the coroner. That could be making sure that policy is changed. So let's say, for an example, if a patient was, let's take the example from earlier, where a patient may have been put into compression when they had peripheral vascular disease, admitted into hospital, then with lower limb ischemia. They had ended up with lower limb ischemia and they developed an infection. Their infection may have been actually not come from their leg, but come from a chest infection. And ultimately, the patient may have other contributing factors, cardiac disease, they may have had diabetes, and all of those other comorbidities might have increased their risk of death, and that person then may have gone on to die. The cause of death might be that multiple causes of death, multiple reasons, but ultimately, if that patient had never been admitted into hospital because they hadn't been put into compression, would they have died? And that's probably not. So at this point, that is when the narrative version, hopefully this is clearer, would have been put in place. And then the coroner is wanting to make suggestions how we prevent that in further. And one of those suggestions might be making sure that a full holistic assessment is put in place, a vascular assessment, so that it was identifiable that that patient had peripheral vascular disease, therefore they wouldn't have been put into compression, and therefore they wouldn't have developed critical limb ischemia and been admitted into hospital, which in likelihood could have saved that patient's life. Hopefully that makes sense. In this afternoon session, we are going to be doing our coroner's court, our virtual coroner's court. So we're going to be hearing from the coroner, and this is going to be based around the issue of a leg ulcer. So we're going to dig into this a lot more. If it's not clear at the moment, it hopefully will be later on when we really take a deep dive into it. So that brings us on then to our record keeping, okay, and our clinical governance and documentation. As I mentioned earlier, our record keeping is incredibly important. Okay, it is an integral part of our roles as nurses and healthcare professionals, and part of the nursing midwifery and allied health professional practice. It's essential, the provision of safe and effective care. Okay, it's not, I love our little, we've put in there just a tiny little phrase, it is not an optional extra. It is not, okay. I know sometimes that we can be very hard pressed and we can be incredibly busy, and we are more interested in the doing of things than the documenting of those things. I've been there myself in high pressure situations where I'm looking at my watch. I know I still have 4 patients to see, but I've got 2 hours to do it in, and I know that's not enough, and I might therefore skimp on my documentation. I have done that before as a nurse. I think probably most healthcare professionals have. Ultimately, though, that is where we're setting ourselves up for pitfalls and for scrutiny. We shouldn't have that mentality. We need to have the mentality of, if I only see 3 rather than that 4, but document them properly, and then I hand that 4th patient over to the next day, okay, and relook at prioritising our patients in our lists, or how well we see that patient, okay. It is better to see less and do less and thoroughly document and hand over to the next shift, to the next nurse, that extra patient we might have tried to squeeze in that may have led to us doing suboptimal record keeping. Okay. Records, just to make sure we understand, are anything that makes reference to the care that we have provided to a patient. And any record can be used as evidence or called as evidence as part of a serious incident investigation or as an investigation by the coroner. Okay, that's anything. And I'll pop on to the next slide so you can see that's anything from anything we have written down, anything we've written on a scrap of paper, even if that paper is found or it's been filed, that can potentially be used. Okay, so let's say something happens to a patient and you've been to a patient's house and you've scribbled something on a scrap of paper, and then you've left that paper there in the patient's house. If it pertains to the patient, that could be brought as evidence. Okay, anything electronic, emails, electronic notes, clinical noting, any letters that have been sent between healthcare professionals and the patient. That can all be pulled and brought as evidence. Any care plans that have been put into place, any risk assessment forms, any photographs that have been taken can often be brought to evidence. And just on a stop on that note, photography is often a very positive thing to be brought because it gives us the visual cue and that point in time of what something may have looked like, especially when we're relating it to wounds. Okay, so photography is often a very good record for us to have so we can show and demonstrate what a wound may have looked like at any one time. Laboratory reports can be pulled, x-rays, telephone conversations either can be pulled. Sometimes telephone conversations can be recorded, especially if we're dealing with any other institutions. But sometimes as well, if patients write out transcripts of telephone conversations, they can be used as well. And then medication and drug charts can also be a form of records that can be pulled and presented as well. Now, I mentioned earlier an old adage that we say, which is if it's not recorded, it didn't happen. Okay. Now, again, I stress that this isn't technically true because we know things happen, even if we haven't recorded them. But if we can't evidence it, then sometimes it might well have not have happened. Okay, we have to be able to evidence it to say that it did. Okay, and that's where our documentation comes in incredibly. It comes in and is so important. So then we also have to make sure we're writing accurate records. Okay, they're clearly legible and they're easily to be easily read. That our language is good, and we are putting down what we mean in our documentation. The more accurate and clear it is, the easier it is to assist us in defending any claims of negligence or by answering the coroner's questions in a coroner's court. Common problems through a lack of documentation, things that we see, absence of clarity. So often things are just not clear. The notes might be so brief. There might be broken sentences, poor actual documentation, so illegible writing potentially if handwritten, or sometimes we all know we love a bit of autocorrect or spell check. If spell check hasn't kicked in, or a bit of autocorrect on something has changed the word completely, we get an absence of clarity. Okay, and sometimes it might seem quite trivial, but sometimes the wrong word here or the wrong spelling can cause an absence of clarity and can cause confusion. Failure to record any action taken when a problem identified. So this is a big one. So if we do identify that there's ever a problem, okay, as healthcare professionals, we should always be acting to address that problem. If we, and most of us will in the moment, we will take steps to address that issue. For instance, let's say we are seeing a lady with a venous leg ulcer. Let's say she's in the community, we've gone out to her house. She has a long-standing venous leg ulcer. She's in compression bandaging. Let's say that we notice one day when we go in that her toes have gone purple and she's complaining that she's losing the feelings in her toes. That potentially is a sign that her vascularity, her arteries are closed or closing or occluded. So the problem there is, oh, we're causing damage. So we take off that compression. Okay, we might then just get on and redress, not put it back into compression and go away. If we haven't recorded that, and then if we haven't recorded that, then and the damage then presents itself, there's already too much damage to that limb and it starts to break down. Then there's ambiguity of when that compression was taken, who did it. Okay, we need to record the action we took, and that nurse at the time should have escalated that as well and referred the patient on to hospital probably for a vascular assessment, but they need to document that it was them that did it and have suggested that be the action that happened at that time. Failure to escalate is often a common problem. Oh, I know that's an issue, I'll do it later, and then you get bogged down with other problems from potential other patients. Someone else comes over and distracts you with other questions, and then you fail to escalate a problem. Often we know we do this, and sometimes we'll go, oh, I forgot to do that yesterday, I'll do it today. Okay, we need to try and not leave that time between escalation. We need to do it there and then where we can. okay? Because it might be that time between the failure to escalate and when we finally do escalate that a clinical incident actually happens relating to that reason. Missing information is also a common problem. We just haven't put the information down. When it comes to wounds or missing or inaccurate wound assessments, I can't tell you the amount of times that I've looked through RCAs and that I've seen missing or poor wound assessments. And it's constantly been an area of frustration. That is one of the cornerstones of things we are doing and what we should be doing when we're reviewing our patients with wounds. Okay, that's not to say we're doing a holistic wound assessment every time we see a patient, but an actual wound assessment we should be doing, and we should be documenting what that wound looks like. Has it got any smaller, etc., etc.? Is there slough? Is there malodor? Always those signs and symptoms very briefly every time we see the wound to show that we are doing a wound assessment as we're there looking at it. It's often those misses and inaccuracies that lead to contention and problems down the line. Infection sometimes, for an example, doesn't present so clearly initially. And if we're not assessing properly, patients can go on to deliver larger infections and potentially sepsis. So if we're not assessing and not documenting what we're seeing, it brings ambiguity. Where did that infection start? Did that actually use no documentation? So was that starting early, and could we have spotted it early and prevented it? As an example. And then inaccurate information, false information that isn't true. This is rare. As healthcare professionals, the majority of us are honest and we put down what we've done, but sometimes we can put down inaccurate information that isn't right, and sometimes that can be accidental. It often comes if we wait till the end of the day. I've done this before, where, for an example, I think I haven't got time to document on X patient now, I'm going to document on them later. So at the end of the day, I've got 5 patients I need to document on, and suddenly the lines have become blurred in my head, one patient to another. Especially if I've seen 3 patients with leg ulcers. What did I do for each patient? Was my reduced compression bandaging on patient A, or was it patient B? And then I'm open to potentially putting inaccurate information down, and my own recollection of that day's events might be hazy, or I might get it wrong, especially if I'm hurrying. This is why it's always important to document there and then when you can, to make sure it's accurate as what you've just done. Okay, so coming towards the end of this little information session, but we're just going to look at some common issues found in patients' records that have been pulled out from examples in Coroners Court. So you can see on your screen, you've got some of these little issues that have come up. Leaking plus, 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 or plus, plus, plus. What does that mean? What does leaking plus, plus, plus mean? I don't know. That might mean something to me. It might mean something completely different to something else. We should be more descriptive. Okay. The patient's dressing had saturated through and was leaking out, therefore high levels of exudate. That tells me clearly that the dressing was not managing and that there was very high levels. Okay, and technically what happened? Very brief little sentence rather than just plus, 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 plus. Dressed as plan. What's the plan? Is it dressed as plan? When was that plan from? Okay, was that plan the plan from 4 weeks ago, or was that plan from the last review when someone changed the plan? Dressed as plan gives no information. Okay, things could have changed. You may have gone in there and not read the previous notes and seen that the nurse had changed the plan and been so used to doing the same thing with that patient, you've written this. Ultimately, that would be scrutinised and seen that you've done something completely different to what the person may have assessed before and changed the plan. Ulcer deteriorated. How? What's deteriorated? What are the measurements? What's that defined as? Is it bigger? Is the quality of tissue worse? Is the granulation become friable? Is there lots of slough? We need to be more specific in what that is. Care given as planned, dressed as planned, similar scenario. Compression applied. Okay, what compression did you apply? Did you apply reduced or full compression? Did you apply reduced compression bandaging or reduced compression hosiery? Those little things make a big difference when we're having our documentation reviewed. Okay, that consistency and clarity is what makes our documentation excellent. Compression declined. That's okay. Why? Why did the patient decline? Did we address why the patient declined? Did we give them information, try to address their concerns to make them more accepting of taking that compression in? It's easy to say for a patient, no, I don't like compression, I don't fancy that. If they don't understand why it's important, then if we just say declined and we haven't educated that patient on why compression is important, that's a lapse of care and a lapse of our judgment. Okay, we should have really educated that patient. Once they're educated, much more likely to say, actually, I will give that compression a try. So we need to put more substance, not just compression decline. Why did they decline it? How is that declined after explaining the importance of compression? Continue to decline. Decline because their pain is too high. Okay, we need those reasons. And often this can be addressed with 3 little words. Okay, 3 little words. And these are all examples of where 3 little words can give extra meat onto the bones of that documentation to give it more heft, okay, more description and more clarity. So wound to leg, for example, that first one, wound to leg, okay, where on the leg? Wound to left lateral malleolus, okay, instantly left lateral malleolus, we know it's on the left leg, or medial malleolus, sorry, I can't read, medial malleolus. So we know it's the inside malleolus, and the malleolus being the bone of our ankle. So we know exactly where that wound is, because the patient might have more than one wound on that leg. Which wound are we referring to? Those 3 little words make it clear which wound we are referring to on that patient's leg. Antimicrobial applied. Why? Why did you put an antimicrobial on? Is it because you just like the dressing? Is it because that's what was used before? Why have you chosen that? 3 little words: manage bacterial burden. Okay, you're giving evidence that there is a burden there, a level of bacteria that you're worried about, which is why you've chosen that antimicrobial. More information is even better, but that is 3 little words to give more substance. And each one of these that you can see on the screen is a really good example of where 3 little words can just give that extra substance to your documentation and extra clarity to reduce any confusion in the future if you ever were investigated or your documentation ever was investigated. Just for the sake of time, I won't go through all of them. That kind of brings us to the end of that first little session. We've been going for about 50 minutes, just over an hour on that. So there's a lot to dive into, and we're going to flesh out everything we've discussed this morning in the session coming up shortly. But before I do hand over to Rommel, and before we have a brief little 5-10 minute break, I just want to speak to you about the 3-step approach by Coloplast. So what this is when we're thinking about treatment, this is a way that we can simplify our wound management. And when we're thinking about leg ulcers and how complex they are, how many steps can be potentially involved in managing these leg ulcers, simplifying our plan, making sure that we are doing the right things at the right time is incredibly important to do. And the 3-step approach by Coloplast can really help us give a nice, succinct management plan to our patients. So step 1 of our 3-step approach is assessing. So that is just to remind you, always do your holistic wound assessment, okay? If this is the first time a patient is presenting, do your holistic wound assessment. Take the time, read the notes, make sure you understand everything about them. Are they diabetic? Is their diabetes being well managed? What's their nutrition capacity like? Do they need a dietitian? Not just that hole in the patient, but looking at the whole of the patient and using your local assessment guidelines or pathways to do that full holistic assessment. Again, and then making sure we're doing that regularly. A full holistic assessment roughly should be every 4 weeks, or if the patient's condition changes significantly. Our step 2 is to prepare the wound. So that is to physically debride the wound, to prepare the wound for healing. It's removing the barriers that might prevent healing. So removing any slough, any bacteria, and to create the optimum healing environment. Physically cleaning the wound using a wound preparation device to lift and remove that bacteria, slough, is incredibly important. And we know through a lot of evidence that we are generating and coming through globally that cleaning and preparing wounds is actually starting to become the cornerstone of optimal wound healing. And then step 3 is treating, choosing an appropriate dressing to keep a moist wound environment that's going to manage exudate, help manage pain, that's going to help to conform to the wound bed, and help to facilitate moist wound healing in an optimum manner. At this point, that holistic assessment, just want to highlight how important it is. Okay, you have to understand your patient to understand the other contributing factors. Without doing a holistic assessment, we're not going to find out if their leg ulcer is venous or arterial. We're going to be shooting in the dark. Okay, we're not going to understand the other factors in and around them. But also we need to dig deeply into their wound as well. And we also need to consider wound related issues when we're doing our holistic assessment. So ultimately, what's the depth of the wound? What are the exudate levels? Okay, 80% of wounds are less than 2 centimeters deep, so aren't big cavities. And when these little gaps are left, we can get pooling through exudate leaving in the wound bed and at the bottom of the wound bed, and this can facilitate bacterial growth leading to an increased risk of infection. So it's really important that we're assessing fully the wound itself, as well as looking at the whole of the patient, that we are looking at the depth of that hole. We're looking at the wound edge, we're looking at the peri-wound skin, and we're looking at things like, is it macerated? Are we choosing an appropriate dressing to prevent maceration? Are we looking at the wound edge? Is it contracting at the side? Is the wound too dry? Do we need to encourage more of a moist wound healing environment? So this lady that you can see at the top left of your screen is a podiatry operations manager from Hull. Her name is Donna Welsh, and she gave us a lovely quote when she was doing a bit of work with Coloplast. It's not what we put on a wound that heals it often, it's what we take off. And what Donna is referring to here is she's referring to wound preparation. She's referring to the importance of cleaning a wound and removing those barriers to healing. Slough, non-viable tissue and biofilm all delay the wound healing process. We know this really well. They increase the risk of infection, they inhibit the development of new healthy tissue, and they can limit our ability to assess the wound because we can't see past lots of fibrotic slough, for example, and we can't see what's underneath. There might be a bigger cavity, there may be an abscess, there might be bone underneath that. So we won't be able to make as good informed choices. So through thorough cleaning and wound preparation and debridement, we can remove those barriers to healing, giving us the full view of the wound and have confidence that we're reducing the level of bacteria, we're pulling away all of that non-viable tissue, which can lead to further complications. Okay, and it's a lovely quote of Donna's there, and it is often very true. And it just exemplifies how important that wound preparation is. As I mentioned earlier, often we can develop with our wounds. There's generally always some form of depth to them, even if it looks superficial. We often still have a small depth, and treating that gap is really important. When we have gap, and if we have any dead space after we've put our dressing on, we can get pooling of exudate, and that leads to bacterial growth, a lovely environment for bacteria to grow and divide, leading to increased risk of infection. As well, if our dressing's not fully in contact with the wound, it can reduce the autolytic debridement of the wound. It can not pull away the fluid, not sequester the bacteria into the dressing as much. So it's really important we close that gap within the wound. And it's been agreed by lots of other key opinion leaders around the country and the globe that managing that gap is incredibly important. And 98% in a poll that was done with key opinion leaders in wound care agreed that managing that gap is incredibly important to effectively manage wound healing. And 83% agreed that the best dressing choice for wounds up to 2 centimeters deep is a dressing that conforms well to the wound bed, that is in full contact with the wound bed, allowing that sequestration of fluid and bacteria that is in contact, keeping that moist environment and helping to break down any slough that might be there. So it's always important to use a dressing that absorbs vertically and conforms well to the wound bed and actually retains that exudate and doesn't put it back into the wound. Now that leads me nicely onto an example of where the Coloplast 3-step approach has worked incredibly well. On the screen at the minute you can see a case study of a patient. This is actually a patient of mine who I managed in clinic last year in my clinic in Birmingham. This patient was a 67-year-old man and had a long-term venous leg ulcer for 18 months. Unfortunately, he was a mechanic. He worked on trains. He was a train mechanic. I'd never come across one before, but apparently trains do have mechanics and it's quite a big business. And he was constantly on his feet, constantly walking around. And in his role, he was self-employed. So he's contracted out to different companies to provide mechanics. So he didn't have sick pay. He didn't have any nice health benefits to lean back on. His job was his livelihood. And his wound had really started to impact on his ability to deliver his job. It'd been there for 18 months. It had been getting slowly bigger, slowly more painful. It had rendered him with cellulitis a couple of times on antibiotics. So he'd been going into work, feeling very unwell on antibiotics even. And he had multiple courses of this. And it wasn't until one of his colleagues said to him one day, I'm going to call him Mick. His name wasn't Mick, but just to give him the patient a name, said, Mick, your leg stinks. It really smells. You need to get that sorted. It's not until that happened that he actually sought more treatment, because the GP had just been giving him dressings to self-manage, just been giving him antibiotics when it flared up. No one had given him a proper assessment. This was through primary care. His practice nurse hadn't done an ABPI. Hadn't been able to put him into compression therapy, hadn't had a holistic assessment. So he was referred to me. When I saw him, it was true that he'd just been getting over an acute infection, so he was just finishing a course of antibiotics. And you can see on the 23rd of the 4th, that was what his wound looked like. And he had a local infection clearly. So no clinical signs of spreading infection, but he had real strong local infection signs. So he had friable granulation tissue. He still had a lot of pain within his wound. He still had some moderate levels of wound exudate, which was actually quite pus-like. There was a clear malodor from the wound itself, not just the exudate. And the tissue you can see on the screen there, that was actually really unhealthy granulation tissue. And when I started to prepare his wound, after I'd holistically assessed him, and I found that he was a venous ulcer, his blood arterial flow was beautiful. It was clearly his veins. You can see he's got hemosiderin staining on the edge of the photo there. He had some dry skin. He had a little bit of atrophy, blanch and scar tissue buildup around his ankle as well. He had some higher varicose veins and ankle flare. The little veins had popped on his ankle. It was very clear that this was venous. Had very other few comorbidities. He was a diabetic as well, but well managed. Never really any problems. He didn't have any neuropathy. But it was clear that his wound, he needed compression therapy, he needed strong compression therapy, but also the bioburden and the debris within his wounds was horrendous. When I started to prepare, that granulation tissue that you can see on the screen on the 23rd of the 4th, most of that actually came away, giving his wound more depth. And on the next photo, you can actually see, and this is after a month of healing, it was much deeper than this, but you can see there's still more depth there. But the wound at this point was healing beautifully. We kept it lovely and clean through regular debridement, using the All Prep pad to lift and keep on lifting that slough, keep on breaking up the bacteria and minimizing the bacterial colonization of that wound. And within 2 months, just under 2 months, 6 weeks, that patient had fully healed a wound that he'd had for 18 months. And he's still healed to this day. He went into maintenance compression hosiery, which he's wearing gladly. I had a recent checkup with him actually. Check his hosiery was working well. He's still really happy with it. He's had some new, he's due for some new hosiery shortly, and he's doing really, really well and no incidents, and couldn't be happier. So it just shows you when we get it right, It was a simple, I treated obviously as well. He had an infection. I forgot to mention, sorry. I treated with biotin silicon AG, an antimicrobial initially at that 23 weeks to try and get on top of the bioburden as well. So silver dressing, we used that for 2 weeks, 3 weeks actually, because there's still a bit of bioburden. But by the 17th of the 5th, we were just onto a normal biotin silicon, and we used that biotin silicon, which closed that gap, conformed and gave that wound bed a lovely hug. And with our compression, led to healing easily within our 6 weeks. So a really good example of a chronic leg ulcer where a good, robust, simple 3-step approach with good holistic assessment led to brilliant, perfect outcomes. If we hadn't intervened with this patient this time, he could well still have this ulcer, multiple hospital potential admissions, multiple cellulitis, more antibiotics. So really, really good prevention as well. Lastly, I'm just going to very briefly just show you that there are so many tools out there to assist you with leg ulcer management, to guide you with really good leg ulcer care. This is an example, is just Coloplast's venous leg ulcer pathway, which will be sent out to you today as a resource if you so wish to use it. But there are other really good resources out there. The National Wound Care Strategy had some really good guidance. Legs Matter website provide really good guidance and reference to a lot of pathways, and the best practice statement I mentioned earlier has their own pathway very similar to this as well, which guides you to really good holistic assessment of leg ulcers. And also just a little simplifying product choice. Again, this is just Coloplast's little way of, if we really want to keep it simple and follow our lovely 3 steps with just simple dressing choice, where you can use our products effectively under compression, and give you confidence that you're using the right dressing. Right then, I'm fully aware that I have been waffling on for some time, and that is a very listening and slide heavy presentation. So now we're going to, I'm going to hand over to Rommel. We're going to have a little 5 to 10 minute break. I actually can't see the time at the moment. So I'm going to hand over to Rommel, and we'll have a little break, and then we're going to dig into the meat of Coroners. We're going to have a real interactive session. Okay, so
thank you very
Rommel,
much.
anything to add?
Yes, thank you very much, Joseph. That was absolutely fantastic. And to you guys, the chat has been very busy. Now, in the interest of time, before I send you for there's a lot of applause for you there. That's fantastic. So,
thank you. I can't see anyone on my screen, so it's very strange, very surreal.
It's difficult, isn't it? There's a hand up. Fidelma, did you want to speak? Or was it for the applause? Maybe it's just for the applause. They accidentally put their hand up.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, the chat has been very busy. I think what I would like to address though, before we go on for a break, is about hopefully that session that provides you with that level of confidence in terms of screening of red flags and initiating the immediate and necessary care in terms of lower limb management. There's quite a lot of chat and discussion around duty of candor, around RCA versus a PSERV. Completely taking your point, PSERV is more of a system approach, and it gives you that system learning rather than a linear approach versus an RCA. Duty of candor, look at your trust policy in terms of how this is being implemented in your local trust. But to those who have responded to some of the queries from the audience and the chat, thank you very much. We've got a very different experienced staff within this webinar. So keep up the good work in terms of expressing your concerns in the chat and the participation. So I'm going to send you off for about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and do the Coroners Court simulation. All right, see you in 5 minutes.
See you in 5 minutes, everybody.
Right, welcome back, everybody. Joseph, can you hear me? I just want to make sure that you can hear me.
I can.
Yeah, perfect. Right.
I'm back.
Good. Everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a good 5-minute break, had some water, had a cup of tea. So welcome to the final part of this webinar, to meet the coroner in court. Now, this is a simulation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, my background and Joseph's background, we are in tissue viability. So I've been a tissue viability nurse for over 20 years. We are not a coroner, okay? So hence, this is a simulation. So as part of the simulation, oops, let me just move that slide. So as part of the simulation, together, so I'd like is that all of us, let us immerse ourselves and allow yourselves to be transported into the courtroom as I share the videos. So I will be sharing a total of 4 videos. Joseph will launch a poll to see what your thoughts are after each video, and we'll have some discussion points. Okay, so without further ado, let's go into the simulation.
Volume. Joseph, Rommel, you need to share with audio. So if you stop the presentation.
Thanks, Ben. Rookie error.
No
Okay,
worries.
there we go. Let's me start again. So, okay.
Can't get the help nowadays, can you, people?
Let's start this.
The evidence requested.
Okay, let's start again. So hopefully the audio will come through.
I'm resuming the inquest this morning into the death of...
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Yep, thank you.
Of Elizabeth Mary Black, which was initially opened on the 27th of June 2021. It's my duty today to listen to the evidence requested in order to assist me in answering 4 questions: who the deceased was, and when, where, and how they came by their death. Who, when, and where are usually straightforward. It's
Ben.
If you
I'm resuming
just
the
click back
inquest
on
this morning into the death of Elizabeth Mary Black, which was initially opened on the 27th of June 2021. It's my duty today to listen to the evidence requested in order to assist me in answering 4 questions: who the deceased was, and when, where, and how they came by their death. Who, when, and where are usually straightforward. It's how they came by their death I need help with. I confirm the deceased's full name was Elizabeth Mary Black. She was born on the 1st of January 1942 and died on the 14th of June 2021 whilst an inpatient at Spiral Down Hospital. In order for me to be able to issue a death certificate, I need to establish the circumstances surrounding Elizabeth's death. I will gather the evidence, and based upon that, I will then issue a death certificate. Depending on the evidence heard today, it may be that I cannot conclude death due to natural causes, in which case I will form a narrative version. Under Rule 42, no verdict shall be framed in such a way as to appear to determine any question of civil liability or criminal liability. That is for the courts to decide. Based on the witness statements I've received to date, I have decided not to have a jury for this case. I may have to reverse that decision should evidence come to light today that suggests a jury may be required. To assist me today, I have called upon witnesses. Elizabeth was 79 years old. She had a medical history which included hypertension, atrial fibrillation, type 2 diabetes mellitus, rheumatoid arthritis, and varicose veins. We've heard from the pathologist, who established the cause of death to be 1A, sepsis, 1B, cardiac failure, 2A, type 2 diabetes mellitus. The sequence of events started with a skin tear to Elizabeth's leg, which became infected, and sepsis then developed, requiring the limb to be amputated. Following this, further infection set in the surgical wound site, and Elizabeth never recovered from the surgery. We will hear from witnesses today to answer questions relating to the care and management of the wound in order to determine whether the wound sepsis leading to cardiac failure could have been prevented. Can I please call Ms. Brown to the stand? Can you please confirm your name and current employment?
My name is Ms. Brown and I'm the clinical manager at Boot Hill Nursing Home.
Were you involved in the care of Elizabeth, and in what capacity?
Yes, I was, as a community nurse at that time.
Can you explain to the court your experience and role?
I am a registered nurse and I had been working in the community for about 6 months, caring for Elizabeth. Prior to that, I had worked on the care of the elderly ward since qualifying last year.
What kind of things do you deal with as a community nurse?
We see patients who need injections, end-of-life care, pressure ulcer prevention and management, and lots of wound dressings.
Can you describe your involvement in the care of Elizabeth?
Elizabeth was referred to us by her GP to dress a wound to her left leg. She had caught her leg on a chair, which had caused a small skin tear. I saw Elizabeth the day after her doctor had visited and was concerned about a lot of leg swelling. The wound was quite small and I thought it would heal quite quickly, so I just applied a traditional adhesive dressing to her leg. That was on the Monday. I explained to her that everything should be all right for a few days and I would see her again on the Friday, as we were really busy that week.
What were your concerns about the swelling of her legs, and what did you do?
Well, I wasn't too concerned. I mean, her legs were swollen, but a lot of our patients have swollen legs, and Elizabeth had just been seen by her GP, but I did leave a message asking the GP to review her.
I understand Elizabeth was visited again earlier than planned. Can you explain what you found?
Well, I visited on the Thursday, as Elizabeth's son had rung our office and requested an urgent visit, and I was really shocked when I saw Elizabeth. Both her legs were now swollen and leaking, and her son had wrapped some towels around them. And when I took the adhesive dressing off, her skin came away with it, as her skin was so delicate. The wound was now much bigger, and her other leg was also leaking.
What did you do?
I called the team leader, as I wasn't sure what I could do. And she told me to use a soft silicone foam dressing and to bandage her legs from toe to knee in a wool bandage and a crepe bandage until she could arrange an assessment.
What happened next?
Well, I was sent in to change Elizabeth's dressings regularly over the next few weeks, and I just continued with the silicone foam and the wool and the crepe bandage. I think for about 2 months or more, there wasn't much change. But some days they were quite smelly with more leakage, and some days they just looked worse than others. We kept taking wound swabs, and she had been on a lot of antibiotics, but she often didn't take them as they gave her diarrhea. I don't think she was going to bed, and I don't really think she did what she was told.
What did you do to encourage Elizabeth to go to bed?
I couldn't really do anything, as I can't make her. But she said she could get comfortable enough in her armchair with her feet on a little stool, although sometimes this made her heels feel sore. Eventually, the team leader was able to visit, and she did a Doppler and put some compression bandages on Elizabeth. At first, I couldn't do this as I needed training. So there was a course which I attended, so I could carry on seeing Elizabeth to bandage her legs. I thought I'd developed a good relationship with Elizabeth, so I was pleased I could continue to see her.
How did you feel her wounds were progressing?
Well, the wounds were getting a lot better, but Elizabeth was non-concordant and she kept trying to take the bandages off so she could get her shoes on or pushing them down. On one occasion, a previous nurse had bandaged from further back on Elizabeth's foot, so there was no bandages around the forefoot. I did the same, but by then her foot was so swollen she couldn't get her shoes on anyway. And as the wound was nearly healed, I decided to leave the bandages off altogether. I thought this would give the wound a chance to dry up and to heal properly. And I just continued with the foam dressing as Elizabeth was really unhappy.
Did Elizabeth's legs deteriorate?
Yes, they did, and ever so quickly. I panicked and I called the tissue viability nurse myself. The TVN came out and checked Elizabeth's Dopplers again and agreed that she needed compression bandages. And she talked to Elizabeth for a long time about how to rest her legs properly and the importance of proper bed rest, but also plenty of exercise and good nutrition. And she started her in strong compression. I couldn't believe how quickly Elizabeth's legs started to improve again. Unfortunately, though, she developed another infection. And this time she was admitted to hospital. And when she came home, her legs were open and leaking everywhere. The skin on her legs was raw. I don't know why they stopped using the bandages, so I just continued with the foam dressing, the woolen crepe. She also now had a pressure ulcer on her left heel, which she said she was admitted with, but I'm sure she never had any pressure ulcers when she went in. In the end, she was admitted again as she quickly developed another infection, but this time when she came home, she had her compression bandages on and she was on insulin.
Did her wounds start to heal again?
Well, at first they did, but then after about 2 weeks, I thought I could see a small bit of bone or tendon showing in the wound, but I wasn't sure. The wound was smelly again, and so I took another wound swab, even though one had been taken the week before. And I said that I would visit again in 2 days. The next day I spoke to the team leader who requested another visit from the tissue viability nurse.
Why did you not document that you could see bone or tendon in the wound in your records?
I wasn't sure what it was I could see. But when I went back, it was obviously tendon with about 10 centimetres showing. So I rang the doctor and the receptionist said she was unable to visit and she would ring me back. And when she rang back, she told me the doctor had prescribed antibiotics. But I was so worried, I went to see Dr. Porter myself. And when she eventually agreed to meet me and she saw the leg, she admitted Elizabeth straight away and she suspected sepsis.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Right. That was a very interesting scenario. Now, Joseph, are you ready to launch the poll, please? Let's have a look. And if you can read it out loudly for me, just to remind me what the question is, that would be great. What are your thoughts, guys? I've been writing a couple of bits and pieces here, so it'll be interesting to see what your answer for the poll. Are we ready to launch, Joseph? No pressure. Technology is not my expertise, hence I've delegated it to somebody. So hopefully he'll have some help there. After the poll, I will present a slide with some points of discussion wherein we'll pick out bits and pieces that was relayed by Miss Brown, who is the community nurse, to the coroner, and what her experience and how she managed Elizabeth's care right from the get-go towards escalation and towards the improvement, or when she discontinued certain types of treatment and when the wound started to deteriorate. Any news on the poll, Joseph? Ben, can you see the poll?
Sorry, my mic was turned off. Yes, currently the polls going. Currently, no is winning with 75% of the vote.
That's interesting, isn't it? How many has responded?
We've got 156 responses so far.
Okay, there's about 300 of you. Let's see whether we can reach closer to 100. So 156 responded no.
Choose one. We're currently at 162 responses, still 75% saying no.
Right. So that's interesting, isn't it? Was Elizabeth concord? What was the question? Was Elizabeth concordant? Was that
Was
right? Am I right?
Elizabeth concordant? The poll should have popped up in the middle of the screen for most people. If not, it's in the chat. If you look back in the chat, it should be there within the chat.
If you're using your phone, some will find it a little bit challenging, but that's an
Yeah.
interesting response. It's about 75% said that Elizabeth wasn't concordant. Okay. Is it going up or have we stopped
We're
at
at
certain number now?
76%,
Okay,
188 responses.
76%. Okay, let's unpick this. I think it's interesting that majority of you think that Elizabeth wasn't concordant to her care. Now, when we look at the definition of concordance, now some will say adherence to care, or it's about following a shared decision care plan, for example. Now, I don't think that Elizabeth was sort of involved in the decision-making process in terms of what that treatment pathway would look like. Because to start with, correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth wasn't put into compression, which is the appropriate treatment pathway for this group of patients. And I don't think she was even consulted. And when we look at the case, Elizabeth will only try and unpick or unroll the bandages on the foot part because she wanted to wear a certain footwear. And when the tissue viability nurse managed to spend more time with Elizabeth and explain the benefit of compression and the benefit of elevation and good nutrition, Elizabeth's wound or limb started to improve. So I think it depends on what context we're looking at an Elizabeth concordance. I don't know what's your thoughts, Joseph, on that.
I think you're completely right, Ronald. I think the important thing in this, I think Elizabeth had the capacity to be concordant and to fully, but she didn't understand the reasons. And I think it lies back to when I said in my presentation, one of the things it's most important for us to do as healthcare professionals is make sure our patients understand why we are doing what we are doing. If that patient understands the importance, they're more likely to be concordant with care. Also, I don't feel that she was given the tools to do what she should have. One example, her compression bandaging, she couldn't get her footwear off, so she was taking her compression bandaging off. There's a reason for her non-concordance. Was that reason addressed? Was she provided with suitable footwear that she could still wear with her compression? Again, the answer to that was no. If she did, would she have been concordant? Probably would have been. So definitely it's about educating our patients.
And I think it's about, I think from my perspective, right from the get-go, it's about that rapport building to the patient to get them to comply with the treatment. And I think you would agree with me here, Joseph. I think you're very good at establishing rapport with your patients. And I think if we look at our patient statistic, who's got more compliance, it's probably you. You're very good at this. And I think that is a very important part of our skill as a nurse that we develop, that particularly with patients with venous leg ulcerations and some patients with pressure ulcerations that are quite difficult to manage, that we're asking a lot of them. So establish that good rapport and have that open communication and explain to them on what the treatment is and what you're trying to achieve and get them on board. That there is a difference between us clinicians saying to our patient, you must wear your compression stockings, versus a statement of let's talk about how compression stockings might help you achieve what you want to achieve. Now, when patients come into clinic, they will say, well, there is my wound, fix it. So from my perspective, it's not about here's my wound, fixed it. It's about that is your wound. I'm here to help you. So it's about that contracting. So it's not about you fixing it. It's about you together fixing that problem. And I think it's about I agree, Joseph, in terms of the footwear. It's about finding the troubleshooting solutions for a patient. Most of the time, or majority of the time, there are some other solutions that we can use for patients with lower limb. You know, you mentioned about different types of footwear, different types of compressions, for example. She was on bandages, wrap system could have been considered. So those are some of the elements of it. So I think if we're looking at concordance, if we put it all in context, I think with the right explanation and getting Elizabeth on board with her care, I think she probably would have followed her plan of care and concordance would probably be improved. So that's interesting. All right, let's look at some of the discussion points. I'm going to pick a couple, not all of them, purely in the interest of time. Do you feel that there was a delay in completion of lower limb assessment, or do you feel that initiation of compression therapy was timely? Yeah, was there a delay in lower limb assessment and the administration of compression therapy. Let's have a look at what you can say in the chat. Was there a delay in terms of timeline?
Anyone brave enough to come on and have a little chat? Was there a
type
delay?
in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
there is.
Everyone in the chat. Yes, huge delay. Absolutely. Whoa, my goodness, the chat's gone crazy. Yes, absolutely. Everyone saying yes, no one saying no.
It's not just weeks, isn't it? It was months. They were managing Elizabeth with conservative treatment away from compression for almost 2 months, as Miss Brown has alluded into the case. So significant delay in proper lower limb assessment, looking at red flags. And as you rightly pointed out in your presentation, Joseph, we must screen these type of patients for red flags from the get-go. And if we think that this is potentially a venous leg ulcerations, is start them on mild compression or reduced compression in the absence of ABPI, as long as we screen them for red flags. Now, there was a question earlier during your presentation, Joseph, whether ABPI is a must prior to starting a patient with either a class 1 or reduced or class 1 stockings. And the initial assessment in the absence of red flags, we don't need an ABPI. Start them immediately, because if we don't, potentially increase in edema, delayed in wound healing, and further complications in terms of management of exudate.
Absolutely. And just to add into that, an ABPI is always desirable, and we should be aiming to get 14 weeks. But if we cannot, and there are reasons for that, if it's lack of experienced trained staff, then that just needs thoroughly documenting. And ultimately, we need to make sure we're then trying to escalate to refer to someone who can perform that task. And then you are covered for that incident, ultimately.
Always document. I think somebody mentioned earlier about the trust in the chat about escalation and documentation. Absolutely spot on. And I think somebody in the audience is new to wound care or nursing, so that's so confident in how to administer this type of immediate and necessary care. It's about seeking help. If you don't know, always ask somebody that knows. And if you escalate it to somebody as part of this session, document it who you escalated it to. Right, last discussion point for this particular slide, for this particular video. Did Elizabeth require multiple antibiotics therapy? Should she receive antibiotic without the prescriber seeing the patient? That's interesting, isn't it? Do you see this in practice? Okay. Did Elizabeth require multiple antibiotic therapy? Should she receive antibiotics without a prescriber seeing the patient? Controversial.
Chat's going crazy, Rommel. Again, most people, well, in fact, everyone saying no, shouldn't. And certain people saying if she may not have even required antibiotics, if obviously holistic assessment and the right steps would have been put in place, which is probably absolutely right. We don't know for sure, but would have reduced the risk significantly. So yeah, no. Oh my God, the chat is going so quickly. I'm struggling
to know what? I'm glad to hear those answers, actually, because from an antimicrobial stewardship, highly likely, I know we can't see the wound, but highly likely, probably Elizabeth didn't need all those antibiotics, particularly from the beginning, from the onset of her wound. Just good wound preparation, good compression.
There's a really good point. There's a really good point here. Sorry to interrupt, Ron. There's a really good point. I just want to get it before, because lots of people are mentioning it, that too many wound swabs are being sent. And I think Rachel Holcroft makes a really good point. It's hugely unnecessary. Wound swabs don't diagnose infection. What they do is help us guide antibiotic usage.
That is music to my ears.
Bacteria. So it's music to my ears as a TVN. The amount of times I get GPs prescribing antibiotics when they haven't seen a wound. There's no actual signs of, just because it's not healing. It's crazy. So really good points there. Thank you for picking that up, guys. Antibiotic stewardship is popping up in the chat. Brilliant to see. That's a really big issue to come in the NHS. So absolutely right.
I think really great. I think you mentioned the name Rachel. I think Rachel, well done you. Thank you. That is a really great point, really, that you've raised there, and we completely agree. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on in clinical practice, and I think the problem with it is the lack of education, the lack of understanding of what a venous leg ulceration is. So hopefully those are some of the key points that we need to reflect on in our own clinical practice. And for the purpose of this presentation, take those discussion and learning points, because at the end of this simulation, obviously you as a coroner will deliver your verdict. All right, let's go to video 2. You're a great audience. I love this.
Just wanted to say really quickly before we do, there are loads of comments. I'm trying to go through lots, and there's really good points here. Some things we might not be able to stress. I'm going to try and like where I agree with something. I'm going to try and like as much as I can, guys. Okay, so keep them coming though.
Okay, good. Right, video 2.
I now invite Mrs. Smith, representing Community Services, if she has any questions.
Thank you. Yes, I do. Am I correct in thinking that the community nursing team you were working in was under a lot of pressure at this time due to sickness and the taking over of another patch?
Yes, it was terrible. I was missing my lunch breaks and working late every day. There's only so much you can do with 20 or more visits a day.
Did you keep measurements of the wound and report them to your team leader?
Yes, as much as possible, but I knew how busy the team leader was, and she didn't always have the time to listen to me.
Would you say that you had developed a good relationship with Elizabeth?
Oh yes, but she could be quite naughty and non-concordant at times. But we mainly had a laugh about it.
No further questions, Your Honour.
Ms. Best, representing Dr. Porter, the general practitioner, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you. I notice you took several wound swabs. Did you ever discuss these with the doctor?
Not directly, but I rang and spoke to the receptionist.
Why is it that I cannot see any evidence of this? Did you record it anywhere?
No, I expected the receptionist would record this information in her records.
Did you not consider it important to record your conversation?
Well, not really, as the doctor wouldn't see it in our records, would she?
No further questions for this witness, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. You can stand down. I'd like to call to the stand our second witness, Dr. Porter. Can you please confirm your name and current employment?
My name is Dr. Porter, and I'm the lead GP at the Sunnyside Surgery.
Were you Elizabeth's named GP?
Yes.
How many times did you see Elizabeth between November 2020 and June 2021?
Twice. Once when she first injured her leg, and then again in June when the community nurse alerted me to the deterioration and I had Elizabeth admitted to hospital. She was also seen earlier in the year by the practice nurse for disease monitoring.
Would you say it was normal for a GP not to visit more frequently for someone with a wound of this nature?
Yes, I would say that's normal. I would expect the nurse to take the lead in wound management.
Would you have been aware of the risks and the deterioration of the wound?
As I said, I would expect the nurse to keep me updated if there are any problems.
Clearly, the nurses tried to contact you.
Please don't interrupt the court. You'll get your chance to ask questions later. How did you manage the results of the wound swab?
I would have only acted on the results if the nurse had contacted me.
Did you know that the nurse contacted you after the swab was taken at the beginning of June, when she was concerned that the wound was swelling?
I can't answer that question. I have no details of that conversation, so I have no evidence that it ever took place.
How did you communicate your concerns to the hospital staff when you arranged admission for Elizabeth?
I had a telephone discussion with the on-call vascular team.
And was it your impression that Elizabeth would be admitted straight to the vascular ward?
I presumed, possibly. Well, I suppose I couldn't be sure, as I don't know how this would be dealt with in acute.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Ms. Best, any questions?
I don't have any questions.
Mrs. Smith, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Dr. Porter, why did you not visit when the nurse first rang you?
Well, I would have been in surgery at the time. I said I would prescribe antibiotics, and I did speak with the nurse as she was very insistent. And I did actually visit at the end of my surgery.
Is it common that there is a failure to record telephone conversations?
I can only presume that the receptionist was too busy to record all calls, but she was adamant that no one called about Elizabeth.
Do you think that you might start getting the reception staff to record all telephone conversations?
I object to this line of questioning, sir.
I agree. Please move on, Mrs. Smith.
What did you think when you saw the wound?
I was very concerned and I arranged for urgent hospital admission.
Why did you not write a letter to go with the patient?
I had discussed Elizabeth on the telephone with the on-call vascular team. I didn't think a letter was necessary. I had very little time and I expected the wound to be looked at straight away.
I have no further questions for this witness.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. You can stand down.
Okay. Again, another interesting exchange or conversation. Right. Let's move on to the next poll. If you can, you're on mute, Joseph. If you kindly read the poll for me, thank you. Right, is it out?
So the next poll is, when is a wound swab indicated?
Okay, right. So we talk
So here it comes. Check the chat. Make sure you check the chat, guys. If it doesn't pop up on your screen, look at the chat. It should be embedded into your chat.
I'm sure probably perhaps Rachel has picked this up earlier. So when is a wound swab indicated? Okay, right. What's coming through?
Sorry, my screen is frozen. If I can get back to my chat.
And wound swab, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, should not be an indicator or a tool to diagnose wound infection. Diagnosing wound infection is based on clinical signs and symptoms. I think overall, wound swab would be very useful in terms of if we want antibiotics to help manage wound infections. So for example, systemic antibiotics. So I'm not talking about antimicrobials, your antimicrobial dressings. I'm talking about systemic antibiotics. That could be oral or that could be intravenous. It's about identification of the actual bacteria that is present in the wound bed, that it will be sensitive to certain types of antibiotic. So that is one of the main purpose of wound swabbing in relation to wound care. Now, however, in some institutions or organizations, particularly in the acute, it's part of the procedure when you're looking at skin inspection and MRSA screening. So that is another reason why we needed to take a wound swab, or if the wound is failed to heal. So if we got non-healing wound, despite best practice use of antimicrobials and several antibiotics, and you still got a slow or non-healing wound, a wound swab could be indicated there to really look at what are the microorganisms that are present in the wound bed. Joseph?
So we have 184 responses so far.
Yep.
We've got 30% saying if the wound is not progressing, 62% saying if the wound is locally infected, and 6% saying they're unsure.
Okay.
And lots of replies in the chat as well. Some people saying 2 or more signs of infection, could be both systemic wounds, clinical signs and symptoms. Brilliant. Thank you, Tracy. And we've got multiple factors to consider, not just the 2 options. Lizzie, absolutely quite right there. Clinical signs of infection. I think the guidance varies as well from institution to institution. You should always check your local guidance on wound swabbing. You should have some, actually, and it does vary from place to place. But generally, it is recommended if you've developed a local infection, we probably should be swabbing it at that time, because if it goes on to a spreading infection, we're going to want to start antibiotics. And if you've done a good wound swab at locally infected and you've highlighted the causative bacteria, it's likely the GP then is going to be able to prescribe the right antibiotics. We wouldn't ever prescribe antibiotics if the wound is just purely not progressing, because as we know, antibiotics don't heal the wound. Okay, we need to find that underlying cause of why the wound is not progressing. It could be something completely different from infection. It could be the fact that they aren't wearing their compression, etc.
I think it's depending on the clinical context, isn't it? So there's so many ifs and buts from your assessment perspective. But I think overall, the lesson here really, from a clinical stance, is about you need to depend into your knowledge about what does a local infection would look like from a clinical assessment point of view. Wound swab can delay your treatment if you're relying on wound swab to tell you that the wound is infected. We should not be relying on wound swab to tell us whether the wound is infected or not. We should be relying on what we can see at the wound bed, all right?
And Stuart from the Isle of Wight, thank you, Stuart, makes a really good point, saying often wound swabbers only capture the bacteria that's swimming around in the wound and not representative of actually flora or biofilm. So with some of these really complex chronic wounds that we're seeing, these long-term wounds, often the wound swab might tell us very little, and we should be really concentrating on wound preparation and cleaning up that wound as well. So that's a really good point taken as well there, Stuart, especially for our chronic wounds.
Well said, Stuart. I think we're going to go into the discussion around how to take a proper wound swab. I think just briefly cleanse the wound and then take a wound swab, so you are actually getting the true picture of what's going on at the wound bed level. Okay, right. Let's look at some other discussion points that we can explore as part of this case. Why did the solicitor representing the community nursing ask the questions she did? So why did the solicitor representing the community nursing ask the questions that she did initially? Okay. Why do we think? I think that was Miss Smith. She was representing the community services. Why did she ask that line of questioning? Any thoughts? Or why did the solicitor representing the GP ask the nurse those type of questions?
Blame coming up to defend the client.
Defend the client, absolutely. And I think if you are being called to an inquest, you should have a legal team behind you to support you. And their job is to put the trust into a good light and to support you during that process. I think that's why they're asking those line of questionings. Or the other thing, that from a community nursing perspective, she was trying to tease out from Ms. Black in terms of what are the measures that has been put in place potentially, or whether the level of staffing, what was the level of staffing at that particular point in time. So were they trying to avoid Regulation 28? It's something to think about. Right. So another discussion point here, let's pick one. She was seen by the practice nurse to disease monitoring. What could have been done, something's blocking my screen, at this particular stage, possibly to prevent and change the pathway for this lady? She's referring to Elizabeth Black. So during the disease monitoring with it for Elizabeth, what should have been done at that particular point to prevent the disease pathway that happened when she had a lower limb skin tear?
I'm just in the process of letting a few people back in. Sorry.
Okay.
Trying to get them back in.
I think in the interest of time for this, I think my thoughts, and I'm passionate about this, and I think from a practice nursing perspective or GP perspective or any other parts of community nursing, if we are seeing patients with lower limb edema, particularly the chronicity of that lower limb edema, let's not wait for a skin tear to happen or a wound to happen before screening them for red flags and starting them on mild compression. We should be starting this group of patients to some form of compression to prevent venous leg ulcerations. Because I think if we get the prevention right from the get-go, looking at the risks, looking at the signs and symptoms, then I think we will dramatically reduce the number of incidences of VLU in this country. Now, that is potentially utopia, but we need to start somewhere. But I think that is important to acknowledge that early spotting the signs of symptoms of VLU and early prevention would go a long way. And I think if they have done that to Elizabeth, when she sustained that skin tear, it probably wouldn't have deteriorated that quickly. Do you agree, Joseph?
Yeah, absolutely. And some really good points coming in the chat. Again, Rob, it's pinging so quickly. I'm struggling to read sometimes, but some really good points.
They're a good audience. I love it. I love it.
Brilliant. It's really good. The practice nurse should be discussing with the GP, also doing a holistic assessment. It's a team effort. Absolutely brilliant. We shouldn't be, the GP is very specific on waiting for. She's part of it. Everyone is part of this process and should be there to support others. That's some really good pulling out. Mild compression, ABPI, we're referring to vascular, and ultimately another assessment to highlight the issues and be that comms person between the GP and the district nurses, absolutely. So some really good responses coming in as well. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Right, let me pick another one. Do you know, this is another good, not controversial, but good discussion point. Do you document all contacts with other professionals patients, family members, what could the outcome be if not documented? So do you document telephone conversations, for example? Do you document those when you're speaking to other professionals, patients, or family members? Because on this particular case, I think some of the telephone conversations wasn't documented. Hence, Dr. Porter, the GP, denied that it happened purely because of the absence of documentations. Do you regularly document those type of conversations?
Yeah, chat's going brilliant as well. Everyone saying yes,
Okay.
yes, yes. So saying
Perfect.
sometimes I've learnt lesson previously. Yes, to cover myself. Absolutely document. As mentioned earlier, guys, yes, we should be documenting every conversation. Again, we know it's hard with time and how stressed and how difficult our roles can be, but still, even if we're lightly documenting just the key facts and bullet pointing it, we've got to get that documentation in, that we've had that discussion with the GP, with the nurse, with the family members, with the patient. It's got to go in. So yeah, everyone agreeing. Task GP to document everything. Brilliant. Thank you, Jane. That's cracking. Yeah.
Yeah, so remember, as what you said earlier, Joseph, if it hasn't been documented, it hasn't been done. Right? Go on. Interesting
Really
point
good
coming
point.
up.
Martini's just said, one of the examples, Martini, one thing I've learned, it's gone, where's it gone? One thing I've learned which put me in trouble. So thank you for bringing this to the fore, Martini. I didn't ask the full name of the person I'd spoken to and didn't document it. Therefore, the conversation was deemed as useless. So always ask the name and the role of the person and document that name and role. That's a really, really good point, Martini. Don't just ever just assume that people will know who you are referring to. It's really, really good point. Thank you.
That is a brilliant point, because I think in this particular case there was some referral to vascular services in the acute, so it's important to capture those names and their designation. So yeah, and the date and the time of the conversation is always important as well, not just the name and the designation. So appropriate and thorough documentation of those conversations. Now, I can appreciate sometimes you are so busy, but it's about prioritizing those type of conversations and what to document. We don't have to document war and peace, but pick out those key informations that you've discussed to certain professionals or to patients or to family members, and document it. So make sure that there is the evidence that conversation took place. But again, great interaction. Okay. Do we think, are we ready for the next video? Shall we?
I think so. Let's do it.
Go on. Let's have a look.
I'd like now to call Ms. White to the stand. Please confirm your name and current employment.
Yes, I am Miss White, and I am the Advanced Nurse Practitioner in the Accident and Emergency Department.
How long was Elizabeth in your department?
She was prioritised as per our targets of admission within 4 hours.
And what treatment did Elizabeth receive?
She had been started on intravenous antibiotics, as I was sure she had an infection.
Where was the infection?
It was unclear initially, but we now know it was in her leg.
Am I correct in understanding that the bandages were not removed from Elizabeth's leg whilst she was in the Accident and Emergency Department?
Yes, that's correct.
Is that usual practice?
We have very few bandages in the department. We see lots of patients coming in with bandages on their legs and often compression, and we don't have any compression bandages. If we did, the nursing teams are not trained to apply them.
Would you always remove bandages now?
Oh yes, straight away. We have a good supply of dressings and bandages now, and pathways in place for any patients who come in with leg ulcers.
How did Elizabeth seem to you?
Not very well. She had tachycardia and raised blood pressure. Bloods were requested and inflammatory markers were very high, as were her blood sugars. She was showing signs of infection.
So why did you not remove the bandage on her leg to check the wound for infection?
Well, I actually suspected a chest infection, and I did start her on intravenous antibiotics. I did not realise she had an ulcer. No one had told me, and It was a very busy day in the department.
Was the vascular consultant called to see Elizabeth?
No, I arranged for Elizabeth to be admitted to the medical ward.
Were you aware that Elizabeth's GP had spoken to the on-call vascular registrar?
No, I was not made aware of that call.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Mrs. Smith, any questions for this witness?
No, sir. I do not have any questions for this witness.
Ms. Best, do you have any questions for this witness?
Yes, if I may. What I cannot understand is how this lady came through the accident and emergency department without anyone looking at her wound. Could you shed any light on this?
We are not wound care experts and have little experience of treating ulcers in A&E, but we have since had some training on wounds and leg ulcers from our tissue viability team.
Perhaps you may make more of an effort next time.
Please think carefully about your line of questioning. This is not helpful to the court. Do you have any further questions?
I apologise. I have no further questions for this witness.
Thank you. Thank you, Miss White. You can stand down.
I think somebody was told off, wasn't it? Right. Are we ready for the next poll? There you go. Let's go.
Let's get it up. Sorry, I just got to wait for it to. So here we go. Is removing compression and stopping.
Okay.
So is removing compression and stopping the therapy harm? Here we go. It's launching. So check the chat. Remember, it should pop up on your screen. And if you don't see it pop up on your screen, please go to the chat and scroll back if it goes quickly and hit your response. So already the responses are coming in. We've got 70 responses so far, 81% saying no, it's not harm, and 21% saying yes, it is.
Okay, right.
I think just remember with the context of what we're asking the question. So this would be if a patient's admitted into hospital with suspected infection and we're removing the compression, is it considered harm? Just remember that context.
Is it considered harm? I think you mentioned the word of context there, but let's see. There's about 300, well done guys, 343 of you in the audience. Can we hit 200 in terms of response, do we think?
Got 167 so far, 82% saying no.
You can do better, you can do better. Go on, let's wait for 200.
Remember guys, if you can't see it, scroll back up.
Do you have to scroll back up to look at the numbers? Sorry.
If the poll doesn't move with the chat, unfortunately. Okay. So if you and it comes in so quickly, people answering that you've got to scroll back up. But we're at 183 responses, 17 more. Let's get over 200, guys.
What are we saying?
We don't monitor who's answering yes or no, so don't worry. We're not going to be picking you out, so don't worry about responding. This is just for the context of stimulating conversation.
Are we reaching? How many?
186, 187.
Okay.
We might get there, but it's going to be a bit slow. But some really good. Well, the responses are quite mostly no. A lot of people saying, how do we not get a top to toe assessment in this case? I just scrolling back up the chat. I can't remember who it was. I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was, but someone made a really good point in that often this does happen in A&E because of many reasons. And the reason this was put together is to highlight that this does happen frequently in A&E because of the high pace and the high flow of A&E, but often because of the lack of education and policy and procedure put into place with this. And a lot of fear around leg ulceration, bandages do get let go. One of the main reasons in my experience, and Rommel, let me know if you're wrong, is because people see compression and they're scared to touch it, okay, or scared to do anything about it. But often the correct answer is we remove that compression and we assess, okay? While they're in hospital, they're in a good place. They're likely going to be bedbound and bed rested, so they're not going to have their legs down. We should be absolutely taking that off. Sorry, Rommel.
No. I think you're absolutely right there. I think there's a lot of fear around compression bandaging, particularly bandaging. There's a lot of fear around that, and I think we need to unpick that, because compression bandaging is a therapy for it's a gold standard for venous leg ulcerations. But when a patient is admitted to A&E, as Miss White has alluded, suspecting some form of infection, with compression bandaging, this patient was admitted. She's only suspecting respiratory infection. She's not absolutely sure. She should have taken those compression bandages off, and as part of the thorough assessment, have a look at that leg, whether the infection is coming from the leg. And from an A&E perspective, they talk around the lack of resource and the lack of knowledge. And I think that is a poor excuse. A&Es should have basic dressings to manage basic wound care. Once you've taken that compression off, immediate care in terms of basic wound management can be absolutely acceptable at that particular stage in an A&E department. Do your wound assessment, basic dressing, basic bandaging, or retention, or any form of retention, tubular bandage, and leg elevation would have supported some form of venous return. But I think, yeah, the awareness about what needs to happen when somebody takes a compression off in an A&E setting or in the hospital needs to be improved. And I think you mentioned around the potentially the benefit of having some form of policies or pathways. I think somebody's mentioned in the chat would be beneficial. But yes, it's great points, guys. But I think to answer the poll, it's not harm. Leaving that compression actually would do more harm to a patient from a wound infection perspective. Anything to add, Joseph, from your perspective?
No, there's some really good points. This stimulates a really good conversation. Rebecca Howes also states it's not just ED. Patients make it through to the wards. In my experience, I know from your experience, Ron, we've seen this as previous acute TVNs before, patients making it all the way into wards with compression bandaging on that hasn't been taken off for an inspection, especially even if they've got an infection. As a name, there's a couple of comments. I agree with you. An A&E practitioner, basics are expected to be known and done, but then the trust has to provide training and guidance to make sure you, as practitioners in A&E, are aware of what we should be doing. Absolutely. So there's some really good comments coming in. So yeah, absolutely, really good.
I think training and awareness is vital here, particularly from an A&E perspective, and from a ward perspective. This is not uncommon. You would have seen this regularly in your clinical practice. If you are listening to this webinar and you are from an A&E department, or you are working in the ward and there's no processes in place, I would encourage you to go back in your own organization and have a look at how to change that, because basic education around removal of bandages and basic wound assessment and elevation would go a long way in terms of prevention of complications for patients with venous leg ulcerations that are potentially infected, that are coming through in the acute setting.
One last little point. Gemma has made a really good point. Sometimes the patient refuses compression to be removed. That's a really good point, Gemma. Thank you for bringing that up. And it's absolutely right. Sometimes patients are so focused on their compression. They know their compression is the one thing that helps them heal. They don't want it removed for anything. So they will often refuse. In that scenario, though, it's about educating the patient. We need to do a top-to-toe assessment, especially obviously if it's compression, that infection that we're worrying about, and we need to find the source of infection. Then absolutely we have to have a little look at that. So it's a really good point and really well made.
And again, it's about reassurance to the patient, isn't it? That if we take this compression off, we will do something. We don't just leave it off and not do anything. Again, elevation from that perspective. Phone the district nurse, phone the practice nurse who's managing this patient. What are you actually doing with this particular wound? And how is the wound progression if we take the compression off? So get some information, or refer to your tissue viability or leg ulcer specialist in your organization, because different trusts will have different services. So some acute organization will only have tissue viability nurses, and some will have both tissue viability nurses and leg ulcer specialists. or phone your vascular nurse if you've got a vascular nurse in your organization that can help you in terms of reapplication of the compression. But when you phone a practice nurse or a district nurse in terms of asking for more information around compression, make sure that you get the latest ABPI reading of a patient. That saves time from a vascular nurse, TVN, or leg ulcer specialist to say, right, I have to redo this test again before I can reapply the therapy. So make sure you get the type of compression, the latest ABPI reading, and some of the clinical elements in terms of what type of dressings that they're using or any allergies, the basic questions. Now, let's have a look at some of the discussion points here. What was the impact of the GP not sending a letter with the patient when she went into accident and emergency? Okay. What was the impact of the GP not sending the letter? Or the impact of not documenting that conversation from the GP to the vascular team in the acute? What was the impact when the patient went into A&E?
So people are starting to reply on the chat. Oh, my chat's gone. Where's it gone? It disappears when there's so many things coming on and people are typing. It just keeps disappearing and coming back up. So obviously it's miscommunication about the wound. People are saying that they're not getting the right referrals to vascular, that they should have done no clinical background or recommendations for ED. So effectively they're going in blind. It would have helped direct diagnosis, absolutely. Delays treatment. The A&P wasn't aware of the situations. The context, ultimately what people are saying, the context wasn't there to allow the A&E staff to understand the surrounding admission before, which is absolutely right.
I think absolutely, because when Elizabeth landed into A&E and following the triage of Elizabeth, she was put into a medical ward. She should have gone to potentially to a vascular ward, but she was sent to a medical ward purely because they were suspecting respiratory infection rather than lower leg infection. Because if they have spoken to the GP, they probably get the diagnosis right and get Elizabeth into the vascular ward and get Elizabeth into the right treatment pathway. So the absence of good communication and documentation in this particular case has led into Elizabeth landing into a medical ward where she should have been managed by a vascular ward. Right. Last discussion point, again, just briefly, who's responsible is it to remove the dressing and assess the patient's leg? Was it a nurse, a HCA, or a doctor? Whose responsibility is it?
Easy. Oh, Josie Richards straight in there with everybody. Thank you, Josie.
Absolutely.
Yeah, everyone's responsible.
The correct answer. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the last simulation now. Okay, let's go. This is the final video. Or is it the final video? This is the final video.
Can I call Nurse Spears to the stand? Can you confirm your name and current employment?
I'm Miss Spears. I'm a registered nurse, but I've moved from the medical assessment unit and I'm now on the rehab ward.
Were you involved in looking after Elizabeth?
Yes, I was.
Am I correct in thinking that the bandages were left on her leg for a further 4 whole days before being removed?
Yes, that was normal practice when patients had been admitted from community. We usually find out when the bandages were due to be changed and change them on that day.
How did you know when Elizabeth's bandages had been changed?
Elizabeth told me. She was quite good at communicating. She did ask for them to be changed, but I said no because it was important we didn't disturb them.
How was Elizabeth being treated?
She was needing a lot of help to do things, and we were trying to encourage her to eat. And she was having intravenous antibiotics, and her MUST score was improving a little.
What happened when the bandages were removed?
I was horrified. Her leg looked like it was rotting. I'd never seen anything like it. So I called the doctor who called the vascular consultant, and she was moved to the vascular unit. And I understand she had an amputation the next day. She was very poorly after surgery and had an infection in the stump wound. She was on critical care, and I believe she died 2 weeks after surgery.
Thank you. Mrs. Smith, any questions?
Yes, thank you. Miss Spears, would you always ring the community nurses to discuss the bandaging?
Not really. I'm not sure we need to. We are the people looking after her in hospital.
You told the court that you would ask the community nurse when the bandages needed changing, but it would appear that on this occasion you did not do so. Why was that?
Well, Elizabeth could tell me when the bandages were changed, which was on the day she was admitted, so I thought they'd be all right for a few days.
What if Elizabeth couldn't communicate with you?
Elizabeth's son also says she had her bandages changed when she came in.
No further questions, sir.
Miss Best, any questions?
Yes. Miss Spears, if a person is admitted to hospital with a wound, surely as part of their care, you should assess the wound.
I suppose you could say that.
Are you agreeing with me then?
Well, yes and no. I can see your point, but hospital policy is to leave bandages in place until discussed with the community nurse managing the care.
Was the management plan discussed with the community nurse?
I'm not 100% sure. I didn't talk to them, so I don't know if anyone contacted them.
There is no evidence that the ward staff contacted the community nurses at all.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Can I remind you not to interrupt, and then perhaps this expert witness can answer the question.
Was there any documentation in her records?
I'm not sure. I'd have to consult the records.
Well, go ahead then.
No, I cannot find anything about the community nurses.
No further questions, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Nurse Spears. You can stand out.
Okay, so that's the last video. Let's launch the poll as part of the discussion. Right,
Just a delay while my polls load in. Okay, so the poll question is, whose responsibility was it to care for the wound whilst the patient was in the acute care setting? And here it comes. It should be pop-up on
whose
your
responsibility is it?
Easy question. Well, maybe not.
Okay, why are the answers coming through?
Chat's just loading.
I think we've covered this, haven't we? I think maybe.
Yeah, I think we've
There's some more
have
discussion points.
Everyone, we've got 93% acute care nurses. We've got no one for a community or GP, as we should have, and then we've got 4% for ward doctor. So yeah, everyone's saying all the team, doctor and the nurses together, both ward doctors and nurses. And I think you're right there. I think everyone within the acute who's now the patient is now under your care, everyone within that ward area ultimately is responsible. I think that the nurses are the ones tasked to doing the top to toe assessment and the general wound care, but that doesn't mean that the doctors should be ignoring it, and they should be ensuring that, again, that the right care is being given. So yeah.
And I think it's about you've got that sort of discussion around what does responsibility look like versus accountability. So, so the overall accountability lies within the consultant, where Elizabeth was under, but the acute staff has got the responsibility to deliver that care whilst Elizabeth is in the acute setting. So now I think we can see the picture and what happened. Okay, we can see the picture of what happened at the initial injury when Elizabeth had a skin tear, and that journey and that delay in application of compression until she had an ABPI assessment, was put into compression. There's some omissions on some of the care there when they discontinued the compression, when the wound was almost healed, and then it deteriorated, went back into compression, but suddenly developed a wound infection and hence admitted to hospital with some poor communications in between the line from community to acute setting. But sadly, in Elizabeth's case, due to poor medical health and the complications of a wound, she sustained an amputation and sustained and died from it, from the complications of amputation. So having seen what had happened, Remember, you are now acting as a coroner. Now it's over to you to make that decision or make that conclusion. Let's see what your verdict is.
So just
Okay.
really quickly, there are a few people, we know we're right close to the end and people have got patients to see. So just let you see, we are coming to the last little bit, guys. Now we've only got another 5-10 minutes maximum. And I'm just going to pop this poll up for the conclusion.
This is the final
so
poll.
Given everything we've been through, what is your conclusion? Here comes the poll. Should be pop up on your screen.
Can you read the poll out, please?
So what is the conclusion? We've got natural causes narrative, accidental death, unlawful killing, neglect, regulation 28. We've got 69 responses, 94 coming in so far, and we've got 81% of people saying neglect, 12% regulation 28, and 7% narrative.
How many percent narrative?
6%.
6%. That's interesting. And I think I'm not going to discuss natural causes. It's not a natural cause. It wasn't an accidental death. It wasn't murder, unlawful killing. It wasn't a suicide. Now, having delivered these type of simulations, a lot of the audience will look at neglect. But if we look at the definition of neglect, it's about gross failure to provide the disease with the basic needs. So I think in this case, I don't think that Elizabeth was deprived of her basic needs. I think basic needs were delivered. There's some omission of the of some of the care, but overall, some of the basic needs were provided. She wasn't left alone to rot in bed, essentially. So they treated Elizabeth, treated the wound infection. Unfortunately, due to medical condition and other situations, she died. So the appropriate verdict in this particular case is a narrative. So it's about the coroner setting out the circumstances of the death in a detailed way, based on the evidence that was heard following today's simulation. So it's a narrative verdict for today's simulation. But the question is, would you issue a regulation 28 or not? I think. What about you, Joseph? Would you deliver a if you are the coroner?
Absolutely. I think there's the improvements that needed on both sides from the acute and community is clear. And a narrative verdict, because there's so much to it. When we look at that and look at how many failings, and the majority of failings were in communication, to be fair, but there are so many communication failings within, or not failings as such, but lack of a proper assessment and proper care delivered across the community and the acute. There's no clear definitive, this is why, but there are so many that are all contributory towards her death. So the coroner would have no real choice but to put a narrative verdict up and to submit a regulation 28 to both the organisations to say, this is where you've fallen down, this is where you need to make improvements.
Now, I think there's a lot of gaps in practice in terms of capturing what that regulation 28 would look like. But I think if we're looking at it from an A&E perspective, they were trying to elude that they already make some changes, that there's already a pathways in place, that there's already some dressings, basics that are available for patients with leg ulcerations. And I think from an acute perspective, they were trying to avoid a regulation 28 during the inquest. So that's why they were saying those kind of things. And I think from a community perspective, if we're looking at it from the documentation, it is unclear whether systems are in place to improve documentation. But certainly in the community setting, Ms. Smith has said that they already have some training in place so that they'll be confident in terms of escalations and managing patients with bandages. So, and I think in both settings, both were trying to avoid the regulation 28. But again, it's up to the coroner to make that decision whether he is confident that patients in the future will not experience these catastrophic complications following the systems that are put in place and based on what he heard during the inquest. But brilliant. Well done, guys. I'm going to stop sharing now. I know we've slightly overrun. My sincere apology. So on that note, thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you have enjoyed today's session. And I hope to see you in our future webinars. And Ben, if you can kindly, and I think if you want to refresh your knowledge around assessment of leg ulceration, share the link for our Coloplast professionals, and you can have access on different types of e-learning and modules, particularly focusing around leg ulcerations. Anything from you, Joseph?
So just a little thing, are we going to receive a pack with the info and training and a certificate? Ron, you did address that earlier, but would you like to reiterate?
Yep, so you will receive a certificate following today's attendance, and you will also receive a link of the recording of today's session, and you will also receive a pathway, a copy of the pathways that Joseph shared earlier around management of venous leg ulcerations and pathway around simplification of wound management. But yes, do bear with us. It will take us around approximately 2 weeks or 4 weeks maybe to get this to you. But if not, send us a reminder. But again, thank you very much for your participation. And I hope you have a great day ahead of you. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye.